This is Blackstone Joe, and you're listening to Slick Talk.
If I say I'm an oil man, you will agree.
There's the stink of oil about him.
Hello and welcome to episode 130 of Slick Talk. I am your host, Blackstone Joe, and I'm glad you're here. Today's episode is all about the fundamental question, that is, when to change the oil. While this question in of itself really has a universal appeal to really anyone that owns anything that needs oil to do its job, I'm aware of the fact that some folks out there want a quick answer. Let's say, but the truth of the matter is, it really depends. And I'm kind of glad it does, to be honest with you, that we have to suss out a few different factors in helping you decide when to change the oil, because a one-size-fits-all policy would really be a disservice to you, the engine you run, the money you spend taking care of it, and so on. Because I think it would make sense to a lot of you, and also folks that don't even know that much or care to know that much about oil and how it works, is that an oil change interval recommendation for a Toyota Sienna, let's say, that is exclusively going to the grocery store and back home, well, that should be different, right, than a BMW M3 that is trying to find the right mix of street use and track days without doing an oil change every weekend. There should be a little bit of nuance there, and I'm glad to say there is. And while this episode doesn't feature let's say a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow in the form of cracking the code, it doesn't contain an equation that you can, plug in your engine and the mileage on it and arrive at the exact number. There's not going to be that sort of discovery at the end, but rather what I hope to do with this episode, and what I know we can do here, is cross some things off your list of concerns and making that determination, eliminating the things that don't matter so you can focus on the things that do. Let's start the process by crossing one thing off rather definitively, and that is the oil that you run. I'm not trying to break anyone's heart, especially any brand people that may stumble upon this show, but it doesn't matter whether it's top shelf or near the bottom. Basing an oil change interval solely on the product you run leaves quite a bit out. Chief among them, how your engine is wearing, whether or not it's subject to contamination. I mean, think about it. You could have the most incredible oil there is. It's simply not designed to combat things that shouldn't be there. And what's more, the additive package can break down differently depending on the use it's seeing. Think back to my comparison of an M3 and a Sienna. The additives that are exposed to, routinely high RPMs, constant fluctuation in heat cycles. Well, that's quite a bit different than someone who is mainly getting on the highway, going to the grocery store, coming back home. That is likely going to affect how much metal your engine is making, and whether or not that oil's additive package is breaking down in a way that a longer or a shorter run is necessary. So whatever oil you have, you need to look at the use that is being asked of it, and then how it's responding to that very use. Enter an oil analysis. And honestly, why it's so appealing to so many of you out there is getting a look at how that oil is faring. Now, in terms of how oil's holding up, you can mainly look at two factors, that being a viscosity and a TBN. You can also look at insolubles, though they mainly speak to oil filtration and how it's holding up. A normal viscosity, a strong TBN are both good indicators of that oil still holding up well for your engine. And of course, you can use insolubles to take it a step further and look at not only how many oxidized solids are present, but also how well the oil filter is keeping those in check. But no matter the product, if contamination is getting in the crankcase, it's going to cause trouble, be it in the form of poor wear or affecting the physical properties. So even if you're running the good stuff, and I get it, we all have our preferences. I personally use oils that don't use sodium, because it can mask coolant. but that doesn't mean it's going to suit you and what you like. You may really like how your engine runs with Royal Purple, let's say, an oil that uses sodium in a lot of its blends. If you like that oil, the price point, how your engine runs with it, I'm not here to tell you to stop using it. But keep in mind that regardless of preference, there are going to be potential enemies in the field, let's say, that you do not want to expose your engine to over and over simply because you're running a product that you think might be up for the challenge. And unfortunately, that does mean that when certain products put out a particular interval recommendation, let's say, there will be some that will say this oil is good for 25,000 miles. It actually might be. Heck, it could potentially go even longer. But if your engine has a problem that's causing it to create exorbitant amounts of metal, that oil should probably be changed quite a bit sooner regardless, because the more metal that builds up, the more abrasive it can turn the oil. And of course, that is not going to do your engine any favors either. Shorter oil runs are often the ideal scenario for engines that not only are making a lot of metal, but dealing with contamination. Because as that contamination builds up, it will only have more opportunity to do things like thicken or thin the viscosity, cause rapid oxidation, and so on. You can put brand and blend aside when picking that interval, and you can also put calendar time aside. Now, I can certainly appreciate when someone's in the situation where, say, they've just bought a car and they have no idea how long that oil's been in there. They want to get things started on the right foot. I totally understand just changing the oil in that case. But if this is a matter of 6 months, a year, even a few years, recent episodes, I've even brought up examples where the oil has been in use, over 5 years. That's okay, because calendar time alone doesn't result in your engine contributing metal. It doesn't result in the active additive package losing its effectiveness. Really, if you change the oil just based on 6 months or a year, obviously this depends on the kind of driving you're doing, but often that results in simply dumping good oil. Instead, you'll want to focus on actual use. The miles, the hours, maybe the track weekends. Those are the factors to consider, because that's when the engine is actually making metal, and that's when the acidity is actually building up, which is what affects the TBN. And when metals reach a certain point, when the physical properties are out of whack, those are the factors that I want to take into consideration when I'm deciding to change the oil. Now let's talk about a couple of starting points. One being the manufacturer recommendation. That's always a good idea early on, especially when you have a warranty to consider and you don't want to void it by going crazy right off the bat. That's a good starting point, especially when it comes to getting your oil analysis files started. Because an engine should be able to always accomplish a manufacturer recommendation under normal conditions. Obviously things can vary if an engine is exclusively being used for, rigorous hauling or racing or so on. But by and large, the manufacturer recommendation is a safe place to get things going, as is an oil life monitor too. An oil life monitor is generally going to be conservative, and that's a good thing. Usually, even when it hits 0%, the oil is often still in pretty good shape. I say often because there are examples I've seen where the TBN has started to get a bit low despite the OLM not quite hitting 0%. And for that reason, again, you'll always want to go back to the data. But this is about a baseline, because a baseline will give you an evaluation of where things currently stand. However, deciding when to change the oil can often fluctuate based on where things go in that baseline sample and how things trend going forward. If we find that your engine is wearing quite a bit more than average, maybe as a direct reflection of the use it sees, then you may end up needing to shorten that interval. And that's one thing I want to keep in mind as well, is that it's not merely about extending beyond the manufacturer recommendation and always finding that next level. You may need an oil analysis simply to find out that you're running the oil a little too long as well. So the baseline sample, again, often using the manufacturer recommendation or the OLM to begin, that is where we will then determine if you should be extending or if you should be reducing mileage on the oil. Now, if we find that the motor is in good shape and the oil's holding up well, then If you're in the business of extending the oil change interval, which not everyone is, that's why we ask if you're interested in extended oil use on the back of the slip, where to go from there. Like a lot of people's first instinct is to double the oil change interval from where they started. That might be okay if you're, say, sampling like 2,000 miles or 3,000 miles, but I'll often run into situations where customers want to go from like 2,000 miles all the way up to 10. A gradual approach is what works best because a lot can happen over the course of a long oil run, especially relative to what you normally do. Issues with contaminants cropping up, let's say a crack or leak develops along the intake plumbing and that invites excess dirt, or maybe you have an issue with an injector develop, a coolant leak, internal parts wearing more than they normally would, maybe due to harder use being a factor during, say, a pocket of a couple thousand miles, resulting in enough metal buildup that oil should be changed. These are all things to consider, which is why a gradual approach works best. Often for, like a typical, like a minivan or, a car that's, say a Camry that is really just a highway workhorse that is taking someone on long trips routinely. Generally, you're going to look at more incremental increases. If you're going 12,000 miles on the oil, maybe we'll stretch that to 15. Again, it's all about your motor and how it's responding. If it is a Cummins ISX that is already going 25,000, bumping that up to 30 or 35 might be okay. And it's not to say that we are not fans of an ambitious approach. Indeed, we see some passenger cars that are going ridiculously long between oil change intervals, but they've done the work. And that's something that, I want to encourage people not to avoid, is doing the work of actually monitoring how the engine is responding, keeping in mind things like the TBN and the presence of contamination and whether or not the oil has been proving to hold up well. Because if it's not, you need to look at reasons why. If it's losing viscosity, if insolubles are high, that can speak to the oil filter simply hitting their sealing. So you want to keep those things in mind. So to sum up, when you're deciding to change the oil, first, I think it's easy to start with a manufacturer or OEM recommendation for the first sample. Take that, and then let's see where things stand. If we find that the engine is wearing well and the oil's holding up well, then extending that interval would be a good idea. But that doesn't mean you've reached your ceiling. You'll find that ceiling in the form of wear metals and how they're trending, contamination, hopefully the lack thereof, and the physical properties, like the viscosity. Once we see a situation where the active additive has been used up, or maybe you're starting to see the engine wear a bit more on a per mile basis, or maybe there's reason to suspect contamination, then you've likely found that oil change interval. And this isn't a process that, is necessarily going to take years and years to complete. In fact, quite a bit shorter, depending on the mileage you're doing. And on that note, keep in mind, it's not about the calendar time, and it's not about the brand or blend. It's about the actual use. So when you're taking that baseline sample, think of things like miles, hours, or if you're tracking events or weekends, start there with an interval that you know. You've put 3,000 miles. You've mixed in a couple of track days. Then you proceed with building trends. How do you build a trend? Well, it takes 3 samples to start. So I would not take one sample, then take another one where I've mixed in so many different factors, modifications. No. That's not going to give you a nice comparison. I would start by sampling what you normally do, extending gradually if things look good. Think smaller chunks, like a couple thousand at a time. If you double it, you're often missing a lot of important factors in the data. Things like signs of contaminants cropping up you didn't want to ignore, but now there's been so many miles mixed in, it's already caused cylinder area wear, so on and so forth. Instead, you want to string together a few samples where things are, about as consistent as you can reasonably expect. And then drawing that interval out gradually until, again, metals maybe start to act up a little or we see a TBN drop too low. Then you've likely found your ideal interval. One thing's for sure in this process, the right interval, the answer to when you should change the oil, really lies with your engine and its data that it produces. Don't go looking at someone else's example and thinking that it's your own. You may be able to do a lot better, Or you may find that due to differences in use from them to you, you should be dialing it back a bit. Their story isn't yours. That's why we keep a file specific to you and averages specific to you as well. You'll find the answer. It's right there in the samples that you send out. And that's the best part of this journey, is that your answer will indeed be tailored to you. It is not something that anyone has predetermined without acknowledging what it is the oil in your motor is being asked to do. I hope you all found this informative. As you can tell, if you've stuck with me this whole way, there's so much that goes into finding the right interval, and it's something that we like helping our customers do. That's all we have for today's show. Thanks so much for hanging with us. We'll be back soon with episode 131. This is Blackstone Joe, signing off.
The Slick Talk podcast is powered by Blackstone Laboratories. If you're ready to start your oil analysis journey, visit blackstone-labs.com to order your free test kit.